guys, we're getting ready to read out of Across the Wide and Lonesome Prairie, the Oregon Trail Diary of Hattie Campbell, and this setting was in 1847. The author of this was Kristiana Gregory, and the setting, this was originally taking place in Boonesville, Missouri, otherwise known as Missouri. We're seeing them leave Boonesville and go across all of the United States, basically. From Boonesville, they went on a steamboat, went to Independence, and then got off of a steamboat here, got all their supplies they needed, and then got on a wagon train with I'm not positive on, I would have to go back and look for sure, but over 30 wagons, and they all went west. They now have split, and some have went to California, some are still going to Oregon, and then some have just decided to kind of stick around where they were at. So where we were at last was, they were getting close. They were on the Snake River. So we're gonna start on page 106 along the Snake River. 2 days ago, we passed the loudest waterfalls we've ever heard. Tall Joe says that a few years back, some American trappers were in a canoe, but didn't know they was drifting toward rapids. By the time they saw how close they were, it was too late to paddle backward. Over they went, drowning like bugs. That's why it's called American Falls. Some miles later, the river splits in two as it pours over a huge rock down the churning pool. It looks like twin waterfalls, and that's what it's called, Twin Falls. The days are hot as ever. I must keep my sleeves down so my arms won't blister. Hour after hour, the mosquitoes bite through my clothes, but I do not let myself scratch. Remember, she is wearing she's wearing her new dress that she was going to wait until Oregon. Her mama wanted her to wait until Oregon to wear, but she was just really down, and she just put it on, and her mom just smiled at her. She was very kind about it. So I wanted to show you the picture of this. So do you see the waterfalls there? How neat. Okay. So it sounds kind of miserable at this place. Some miles, nope. Another thing, the sand is too hot for us to go barefoot. My shoes split apart, and the only way to keep them on is with a wet leather strip. When it dries, it shrinks tight so I can walk without them falling off. Even so, the sand gets inside and feels lumpy. Sometimes all I can think about is how miserable I am. I wish I could be cheerful as Pepper. She never complains, and like her brother Wade, finds a way to joke. For instance, today she looked down at her feet and laughed. "Hattie," she said, "I bet I'm the only bride that wears her wedding shoes tied on like a bonnet. I know this is selfish, but I'm glad Gideon is busy all day driving their little wagon, because that means Pepper and I can talk all we want. Wouldn't Becky be surprised?" Becky was her best friend back home. "Wouldn't Becky be surprised to learn my new best friend is a married girl?" We nooned by a creek, and I think what we decided before nooned means like they had their lunch. We nooned by a creek in a cool grove of willows. In the distance, there was a rumble like thunder, but the noise didn't stop. Tall Joe said, "Don't be afraid. That 3 miles away is a waterfall so spectacular it'll take your breath away." Ooh, so maybe that waterfall I showed you was not even like the most spectacular one. The families agreed to rest here an extra couple of hours, and whoever wanted to see Shoshone Falls could hike in. Ma and Mrs. Anderson stayed with the littlest children and with Aunt June, who is so uncomfortable. She has to sleep sitting up. I think her baby will be born any day because she is big as a horse. That's not very nice, is it? Jake came with us. He had trouble keeping up, so Gideon and Wade took turns carrying him on their shoulders. Pepper and I had to shout because the falls were so loud. We couldn't hear each other. And oh, what a sight. That is where the Snake River falls 200 feet over a cliff, spray like rain on our faces. There were ferns and delicate flowers along the moist banks. After so many days on the desert, it was the most wonderful, cool feeling. Oh, how I did not want to leave. We stared for just a few minutes, and then it was time to hike back to the wagons. It seems crazy to walk 6 extra miles just to go sightsee, but Aunt June had said, "Go, Hattie. You'll likely never have another chance." When Pepper and I could hear ourselves again, we agreed that if only we weren't in a hurry to beat winter, we'd like to stay in a place longer than a few hours. She said, "I'm feeling tired, Hattie, like I just want to lay my head down and sleep forever." August 1st, 1847. This land is rough and dry. Prickly pear is all along the trail, and beyond much of it is blooming with yellow flowers. It's pretty, but hard not to step on. We are forever picking thorns from our shoes and the hems of our skirts. My ankles are scratched raw and have bled onto my petticoat, which can't be helped, I reckon. Like all the other women, my hem is dragged and stained with mud. There's no use trying so hard to look pretty anymore, I decided. The boys are dirty as us, worse in fact. I have not seen Pa comb his hair since Missouri. He just runs his fingers over his scalp, then puts on his hat. Our oxen are slower each day. After Pa talked to Ma, he took the big trunk full of my sister's things and left it by the side. Oh my gracious. The trunk full of my sister's things and left it by the side of the trail. He also set out the porcelain wash bowl and a cabinet that had been our grandparents', Ma's wedding dress, and a box of his own tools. I waited for Ma to break down crying, but she didn't. Ever since Pa reminded her that Oregon is our last chance to follow a dream, she has stood by him without a complaint. Oh, that I could be as brave as Ma. I opened the abandoned trunk one last time to touch the calico dress, the calico my sisters had worn. How I wanted their dresses for my own, to remember them by, also to look lovely as they had. Ma came up and gently closed the lid. It's time to move on, Hattie. Do you remember what happened to her sisters? They died the year before from a swamp fever, and 4 of her sisters died. Now that all that she has left are 2 brothers. When the wagons pulled out, it looked like we left behind a general store. There were piles of books and plates, a coffee mill, clothes, tools, a roll-top desk. A few women kept to see their treasures thrown out. Even I had a catch in my throat. A few of the women wept to see their treasures thrown out. Even I had a catch in my throat. What will be left when we get to Oregon? I asked Ma. How will we ever make a home? Ma said, "Don't worry, Hattie. Our home is our family, not our possessions." When Mr. Lewis read from the Bible this morning, and after we prayed, I had a new thought about Mrs. Kinker. The farther away from Missouri we go, the more she takes. Maybe she's just scared is all. Maybe the emptier she feels, the more she fills her wagon. Thousand Springs. That's not on my map. I'm going to keep going. Our thermometer showed 101 degrees when we nooned. It's at noon. We wanted to jump in the river to cool off, but it was so far below with no way to hike down. I wish I could cut off the bottom half of my skirt, for it is so hot. On the other side of the river, there was something unusual, a waterfall pouring out of a hole in the canyon wall like a spout of a teapot. Pa said it flows from the underground. It's called Thousand Springs, but it's where it starts. It is a mystery. During this stop, Mr. Kinker got in another argument with Tall Joe. Soon, there were fists. Uh-oh. Uncle Tim and Pa hurried over to pull the men apart. Gentlemen, please get a hold of yourselves, Pa said. We have a long journey ahead of us. But before he could say anything else, Mr. Kinker did a terrible thing. He brushed the dirt off of his sleeves and said to Tall Joe, You ain't telling me what to do anymore. It's hot, and whether you like it or not, I'm gonna take a swim. Then right before our eyes, Mr. Kinker walked to the edge of the cliff, stepped into the midair, and dropped out of sight. For a moment, there was silence, then the piercing scream of Mrs. Kinker. Still along the Snake River, Pa says Mr. Kinker must have been going mad day by day until finally everything got to him. After he jumped, we crowded the edge on our bellies to look over. The river swept him away so fast we soon lost sight of him. Mrs. Kinker fainted from screaming so hard. We carried her to her wagon by Tall Joe himself. I confess, I was too shocked to feel sad. Someone spread a blanket in the shade for her. Tall Joe stood on a wheel and pulled aside the curtain to look inside. He stared for a moment, then turned towards us. Lordy, he said. 2 by 2 we peeked in. Soon there was a crowd. I have never seen such junk. It was piled so high it had to rip through the canvas. Tall Joe said, Go ahead, clean it out, when Pa and some others wondered what to do. Out came Mr. Big's cart, the wheels gone. Mrs. Anderson's claimed her quilt, Pa found his hammer, and there was the milking stool someone gave Pepper for a wedding present. I found Ma's spoon and Rose's plate. I watched from a distance as folks took back their possessions. Mrs. Big stood next to me, also watching, rolling her sleeves up over her big arms. She said, Hattie, so hard as it is, we need to be kind to Mrs. Kinker, whether she deserves it or not. That's what mercy is, honey. Mrs. Kinker had recovered from her faint and was sitting up. She seemed surprised to see the contents of her wagon scattered about. Then, as if suddenly remembered what her husband had done, she covered her face with her hands and began weeping. Tall Joe seemed beside himself. He looked at Pa, then threw his hands in the air. Campbell, I ain't an expert in these matters. What do you reckon we should do? Pa shook his head. I don't know. It was decided we'd spend the night where we was. 5 men rode ahead, searched the river for Mr. Kinker's body. Ma and Aunt June invited Mrs. Kinker to sit with us for supper, but she stayed by her wagon instead. I'm sorry for her that she's lost her husband, even though he was a nasty fellow. How horrible that she saw him jump to his death. Later, I think everyone's confused about how to act. For a few minutes, Mrs. Kinker was treated with the tender sympathies due as a widow, but moments later, folks discovered that there's a thief who took Mr. Big's cart and everything else that's been missing. The next moment, we moved out well before sunup to beat the heat. Gideon and Wade harnessed Mrs. Kinker's 2 oxen and asked if she needed help loading a wagon. "No, boys, thank you," she said quietly, not looking at them. The last I saw of Mrs. Kinker, she was sitting on the trunk, surrounded by her things, looking at the river. We must have crossed the Snake to get to the Fort, boys. Up ahead, there are 3 islands that Tall Joe says we'll use as a stepping stones. His face is sunburned and looks sad. I heard him tell Pa that 2 years ago, when he crossed here, 4 wagons were swept away and the families drowned. Lord, I almost forgot how scared of rivers I am. Man, that was so eventful. Okay. Before bed, after I tucked in Benny, Jake and I sat up by the fire. He said I am his favorite sister. He forgets now that I am his only sister. How sad. Fort Boise. We're almost touching the territory of Oregon. How exciting! I have not wrote for a week or so, but Aunt June says I must put it down quick before I forget, good and bad. Well, they didn't find Mr. Kinker's body. We reached 3 Island Crossing mid-afternoon of the next day. Black clouds and thunder meant rain any minute. Folks discussed if we should cross now or wait for the storm to pass. While Tall Joe leaned forward in his saddle to study the river, something happened that made him decide right quick. There came a rumbling of hooves. Indians on horseback were galloping towards us, shrieking and waving rifles. Before we could turn our wagons into a safe circle, they were gone. Tall Joe shouted instructions, and while word spread from wagons to wagon, the Indians made another pass. No gunfire was exchanged, but we knew they wanted us to get off their land and get off now. Maybe Pa would be mad too if strangers were trampling on our land. I wanted to panic, especially hearing the terrified cries of so many women and babies. I didn't know what scared me more, Indians or the thought of crossing another river. Tall Joe led the first wagons into the water single file. The islands divided, the river into 4 channels. Pa and Uncle Tim watched for 3 hours until it was our turn. The whole time nervous because the Indians had made camp a mile away and we could hear drums. Why God sends babies into the world at times like this, I'll never understand, but he does. Just as we were ready to ford the first channel, Uncle Tim cried out to Ma, "Augusta, hurry." Oh no! Ma and I climbed into their wagon. Aunt June was lying 2 inches of cold water soaked to the skin. She was having her baby. Oh, wait. Aunt June was lying in 2 inches of cold water, soaked to the skin and breathless with pain. The current was fast, for I could feel it turning sideways, then pulling straight, then sideways again. The animal swam with Pa. I was so concerned for Aunt June, I quick forgot to worry about us drowning. As we pulled up onto the first island, Uncle Tim motioned to us behind us to keep going, that we'd catch up. When folks heard a baby was being born in the wet wagon, we found ourselves being given chairs, 4 of them, that we were able to make into a raised bed. Mrs. Lewis handed over a dry quilt and a clean dress for Aunt June to change into. So we crossed the second channel with water washing over our laps, but my aunt snug and dry. Her baby daughter was born just as we pulled into the third island. Her name was River Ann Valentine. The baby was only 5 minutes old when we began to ford the last channel. Screams drew Ma and me to look at the back. There was Mr. Big. He was tied to his seat, leaning hard to the one side, for his wagon was tipping over. When I saw Mrs. Big had fallen into the water and was trying to grab for her husband's hand, I started to leap out to help, but Ma held me back. Mrs. Big swam. Her arms were splashing. Each time she managed to grab a wheel. Each time she managed to grab a wheel or a harness, the wagon tipped deeper toward her. 3 men jumped in. They held on to keep it upright. As another man tried to save Mrs. Big, everything happened so fast. In an instant, Mrs. Big and her rescuer disappeared under the tongue of the wagon. Their splashing arms were seen on the other side, moving with the river. And then they were gone. I screamed and I screamed. Mr. Big cried, "Sarah." He cried and he tried to dive in after her, but he couldn't get out of the rope that was holding him to the seat. His horses kept swimming, and the men holding on were able to keep the wagon from sinking. That's all I want to say for now. That's what she's wrote, and that's all I want to say for now as well. Whew. So, earlier in the, Earlier in her journal, she said that her friend Pepper is one of her best friend, but then Mrs. Big was top. It was next. Thanks for joining me.